Okay, so this week we're going to cover one topic related to the quality of democracy as well, which is the rise of ethnicity or ethnic politics in Latin America, and how this promotion of ethnic agenda led to politicization or construction of particular identities and gave way to ethnic populist parties actually to mobilize along ethnic lines, and in some cases, most especially in Bolivia, they managed to assume power at the national level. And in other countries, ethnic parties and ethnic movements or movement like turned into political parties performed fairly well at the local and the national and parliamentary elections as well. So they gained considerable number of seats in order to push for ethnic agenda. So how or why actually these ethnic cleavages became immensely salient in Latin America, especially with the neoliberal turn as well. That gave way, as I mentioned last week or the one before, the neoliberal turn, according to some studies, with the erosion or the dismantling of corporatist arrangements, it led to demobilization of trade unions or fragmentation of different popular sectors that led to the demobilization of societies. But at the same time, or if you need to look at it from a different angle, the same policies actually, or cutting back on social spending and giving way to new drastic political and economic measures, politicized other groups, especially indigenous people, that started to mobilize along ethnic agenda and to ask for, or actually to push for new issues or to articulate new issues, economic and cultural and political one. They ask for more political representation and more just social order. So actually this politicization of identities or mobilization of indigenous people started or like became obvious in the 90s with the implementation of the neoliberal reform measures, as well as it was like a critical juncture, as I mentioned before. So you can find like a indigenous people mobilization over time and across different countries in the region, in Bolivia, as I mentioned, in the lowland and highlands, Chiapas in Mexico, Mayan Indian in Guatemala, with the like holding like this continental meeting for indigenous people in the early 90s. Indigenous people in Colombia, they participated in the constituent assemblies in order to amend the constitutions that guaranteed actually their cultural rights in the early 90s. And in the late 90s in Ecuador as well, indigenous people participated in the constituent assemblies in order to push for or to guarantee to ratify their cultural rights in the newly amended constitutions. So actually, they started to articulate new issues, most especially land reform, because as I mentioned before, with the erosion or this decline of corporatist arrangements and this rolling back on social spending and land or far-reaching redistributive measures, it included this dismantling of a feudal system with this kind of distribution of lands to peasant communities in the rural areas. So actually they lost this sense or this right to lands or the land security that they had before. So they started, to ask for land reform and to regain their kind of attachment or security to their lands. And this coincided with another call for cultural autonomy, because land was not like a source for material livelihood, but it was like cultural asset as well. So they had like this attachment to their lands or their right to land. So that's why it's part and parcel of their heritage or cultural legacy. So that's why they they attach or associated this call for land reform with cultural autonomy. and they asked for like to preserve their own culture, and one particular pillar to preserve this is to speak the language, just to ratify this in to guarantee this constitutionally by allowing for bilingual education, in order not to impose like this all-encompassing national culture with like the Spanish culture or the mestizo culture. So they asked for their own cultural autonomy by allowing for, by giving space for speaking their own language in the official educational system. So actually, as I mentioned, they became one pivotal, like indigenous movements became one of the pivotal players at the national levels, and they performed well, and they participated in the electoral contestations at the local and national levels, and became like one of the main protagonists in the neoliberal or in the post-neoliberal era. We're going to cover Ecuador and Bolivia. We're going to single out, these two cases, and we're going to see why. And we will tackle this from like culturalist or constructivist perspective, like how, like as I mentioned, neoliberal turn, the implementation of these neoliberal economic measures, it was coincided with actually the political opening or the introduction of democratic regime or institutional reform as well. So this kind of conducive or permissible political environment or institutional setting, that was like, it offered some sort of necessary conditions for indigenous movements to mobilize, or indigenous parties to thrive. But actually the discourse they endorsed, or the political platforms they campaigned on, that appealed to not only indigenous population or indigenous people, but they appealed to wide segments of society. So they reached beyond their core constituencies or of indigenous people, in order to broaden or to expand their base of support. So we're going to tackle this from a constructivist perspective, and how like the construction, the fluidity of this identity give way to the construction of the identity, or politicization of private identities, or give way to new kind of self-identification that became obvious and apparent in the political landscape. So we're going to tackle this from, as I mentioned, cultural perspective, and how indigenous population, or this indigenous mobilization had or actually built on organizational capacity, or capitalized on existing institutional and political opportunities, in order to politicize, to construct identities and politicize identities, and gave way to a new expression of self-identities or self-identification that actually fed into or fed back into these kind of political dynamics and political processes, and most especially in Ecuador and Bolivia. So what's the context of ethnic mobilization? So back again to this neoliberal turn, with the decline or the unraveling of these corporatist institutions or corporatist arrangements. So before this, the establishment of these corporatist organizations, or these organizations actually were based on class cleavages, like popular classes. So people had to get incorporated into these organizations as peasants, as workers. So this actually, the state controlled even not only the subsidies or the funds of these organizations, but also the self-image, or it was kind of imposition of a particular self-identification. So as a peasant or as a worker, so you have to get incorporated into these organizations in order to make use or to benefit from the state distributive policies. So actually, it was like class-based corporatism. So the state imposed particular, we focus on in the indigenous people or indigenous um, movement here. So the state imposed kind of particular identity on them and stripped them of their indigenous identity or ethnic identity by assimilating like them all into this all-encompassing class category. So the dismantling of these corporatist arrangements gave way to different other categories of or different kind of self-identification to emerge and to get politicized in the interaction with other communities in order to push for some new issues or some new demands. So this actually, from this like not only like identity perspective, but also the dismantling of these corporatist arrangements affected the material livelihood of the indigenous population or the peasant communities or the indigenous peasant communities in the rural areas, because it actually did challenge the land tenure by actually liquidating or dismantling this feudal system or this like public distribution of lands. So this affected the economic conditions and the living conditions of indigenous population in some areas. But the thing is, like some corporatist arrangements inherited from this corporatist era, it remained there and it gained over time. It acquired some sort of autonomy, local autonomy. It actually developed some sort of autonomy beyond the reach of the state. So they have like some dense pre-existing networks that like cooperatives, rural unions, like church networks that organize people into particular communities or particular networks and offer them avenues or a space in order to deliberate and to discuss. And these spaces actually were used later in order to develop or to politicize ethnic identities or to mobilize indigenous people along ethnic lines. So they had their own like local organizations or these kind of indigenous communities networks that they managed to preserve, or they managed to carve out some sort of autonomous space at the local level. And they used these organizations in order to reorganize themselves, in order to mobilize for and to articulate new demands. We are going to cover like some confederations, indigenous and peasant confederations in Ecuador, most especially like Ecuador that emerged in 1972, Confne in 1980, and Kone in 1985. So actually, these kind of at the organizational level, so they managed to draw on the pre-existing what Yashar mentioned, trans community networks that offer them space to connect different sporadic or different sites to get them together, and they offer them some logistical facilities in order to deliberate and discuss and to develop new way of understanding of their self-identification or a new identity category of ethnic identities and new cultural norms as well. So this offered them these organizational sedimented or inherited from the corporatist era, along with some sort of institutional reform that followed the implementation of market-oriented policies, most especially the decentralization policies, as I mentioned in the last 2 weeks, and with some sort of political opening that actually safeguarded some political rights in addition to the civil and social rights that were given in the import substitution industrialization era. So this all offered like institutional setting or political opportunity structure in Yashar's term, this transformation from citizenship regime from the corporatist era to the neoliberal citizenship regime that focused mainly on political rights, that like giving people, especially in Ecuador, that they were actually kept from voting before because of literacy conditions. So now indigenous people had like have the right to cast a ballot in the elections. So that's why they engaged in the electoral contestations at the local and the national levels in order to push for, and use these political spaces in order to push for their cultural and economic demands. Not only like social and civil rights that were given by the state in the corporatist period, during the corporatist period, that focused on the economic and social distribution measures with like a state like offered some sort of subsidies, credit, social services like healthcare, building public schools, health clinics, and giving like more facilities with regard to credit in order to enable peasants to cultivate their crops and to transport them later and to sell them, to help them with the selling their outputs. So not only like these rights are no longer confined to these social or civil domain, like the expression of their identity in terms of like the speaking their language, or allowing them to practice their like rituals or customs. So no longer confined to these rights, but also it added like one more layer regarding political rights. So now they have some sort of political rights. They are entitled to some political rights, and they need to practice these rights in order to advance their ethnic based agenda. Decentralization as well, it allowed them to contest in elections at the local level and to push for their demands. All these factors like organizational and in politically environment or political opportunities enabled indigenous population or indigenous movements to mobilize or to articulate their ethnic agenda and to express different kind of private identities publicly. So as I mentioned, we are going to focus on Ecuador and Bolivia, and we will start out with Ecuador. So why actually we study Ecuador? Because CONE actually gained political clout or kind of political influence starting from the 90s. And what's puzzling here that Ecuador is a highly heterogeneous society, and it doesn't have any kind of a strong civil society that would allow for or made it logical, made this emergence of a strong indigenous confederation kind of logical in this country. So in a country with like highly heterogeneous and weak party system and weak civil society organizations, CONE actually managed to emerge as one of the most powerful or the strongest indigenous confederation in Latin America. And actually it played not only like organized like nationwide mass protests that jeopardized economic activities or public activities there in the early 90s, but also the mobilization of indigenous people like helped with unseating or two presidents, especially Bukaram in 1997 and Mahmoud in 2000. And actually they aligned with the military junta against Mahmoud in 2000, and they became one of the allies of the junta government. It was like a short-lived government before the military handed over power to the vice president. So it actually became one of the most influential and powerful political player at the national level in a society that lacked a strong foundation for like civil society, a strong civil society association, or more homogeneous social organizations. So what happened in Ecuador that actually paved the way for this national confederation of indigenous population or indigenous people to become one of the influential or the strongest political actor in Ecuador, starting from the 90s. So as I mentioned, it's highly heterogeneous society. So there is no, you cannot speak of one coherent indigenous community there. There is a division between Andeans and Amazonians, indigenous communities, with the highland and lowlands. And it took like several years or decades for them in order to negotiate positions as indigenous or as Indians, and to converge on a particular or joint set of demands. So as I mentioned, what helped them, these processes, these organizational inherited from the corporatist era on the one hand, and what Yashar mentioned, this trans community networks that did actually offer them organizational capacity to mobilize or to politicize ethnicity, and then to push for ethnic mobilization. And like these kind of on the structural or institutional level, this political opening and enshrining these ethnic rights and cultural rights in the constitutions that allowed them to play important political role. So this offered them incentives to capitalize on the existing political opportunities in order to have an alliance and to push for their agenda. So Ecuador emerged or founded in 1972, and basically to represent Andean indigenous community. In order, again, like the common theme is defending land acquired from the corporatist era in the case of Andean, and for the Amazonians colonized before without any kind of titles, in order to secure or to guarantee this sort of land security and to push for land reform. So that was like a common theme or common issue that brought them together, but the processes of pushing for these demands unfolded differently until they managed to get together in order to form this confederation at the National Confederation for Indigenous People. So actually, they needed to defend their lands acquired from the corporatist era. And as I mentioned, they had some sort of semi-independent space inherited from these corporatist arrangements. The state actually, with the heavy presence of the state with this land distribution measures during the corporatist era, the state previously organized peasant communities into or indigenous communities into comunes as political administrative unit in order to have this kind of legal recognition and to articulate or to channel any petition or legal demands of peasants. So they actually as peasant, so they as like affiliated or related or belonging to this class. So they had to be integrated or organized into these communes or be members in these communes in order to make use or to make benefit of the state policies, or in order to actually to litigate or to have any sort of legal demands through these institutional or organizational channels. So they had also their rural unions that actually defended the right of rural workers in order to improve like the conditions to acquire loans or agricultural credits. And they had also the presence of the churches that actually they organized them into particular networks and offered them some training and some training programs or social services and popular radios as well. All these like pre-existing dense networks offer them some sort of social services, like they provided communities, peasant communities or indigenous communities with some social services like public education, public health, like training and leadership programs. So this, like by offering these kind of training and leadership programs, they train them in how to actually to manage or to lead particular organizations, or to recruit, you know, some leaders in their organizations in order to represent the community, in order to articulate their demands, or in order to actually raise awareness about or um, about some particular issues. So the pre-existing organizations, or the inherited from the corporatist era, and the community networks, it offered some logistical support for indigenous confederation to emerge in the early 70s, and then to take it from there with the neoliberal turn to push for a new set of demands. And actually, it followed some like dual mobilization strategy. So in the beginning, or like during like the 70s, in order to attract more supporters, so the like it was like in order to appeal to like white segments in rural societies, so they have to mobilize along class lines as well. So they need to attract like workers, or left-leaning leaders, or left-leaning organizations alongside their indigenous population. So they developed, you know, this kind of or dual mobilization strategy that focus on both like indigenous identity and class identity, in order to expand their support base. And finally, they started, you know, this negotiation in order to have an alliance with the lowland indigenous confederacy, to negotiate positions with the Amazonians in order to increase their power in the face of the rising power of the state, or this imposition of particular identity on them. So it came later, like the Amazonian indigenous community, like unlike um, so unlike, you know, their the indigenous Andean indigenous communities, Amazonians actually, the state was totally absent from this area. So the state didn't care much about allocating some social funding in order to build infrastructure, to build public schools or health clinics there. So it was like totally neglected areas that allowed Amazonians as indigenous community to colonize lands without gaining any title. But they actually used to cultivate, you know, their to have like their settlements, and to colonize some lands, and to cultivate these lands without gaining any official title. So the like effectively they had some high level of, or high degree of autonomy, from because the area was beyond the reach of the state. But it was because they had, you know, this public, you know, they had this official image as savage in this public imagination. So the state actually left the area to the church and priests to discipline and to control Amazonians and to discipline them. So in while they were autonomous from, or they developed some sort of independence from the state, they were heavily dependent on the church networks that divided them into some sort of vicariates in order to organize them, or to discipline, or to control their activities. So they have their own local networks as well, that offer them space to negotiate their identities, or to develop some new way of understanding with the changing circumstances, or with the changing of the political environment. So what happened with the exhaustion of the import substitution, industrialization, and the lack of like a lack of lands to be distributed, or more lands to be distributed to peasant communities in the highlands. So indigenous communities started to migrate from the highlands and to colonize or to have their own settlements, because anyway, these lands actually they lacked any sort, they are untitled lands. So they migrated and they had their own settlements. They occupied, pieces of lands in order to cultivate and to have their own agricultural activities, like cultivation or clearing jungle, or cattle grazing. So this kind of new form of colonization from this um, highlands indigenous communities, it triggered resentful feelings and politicized the identity of Amazonians as Amazonians against, on the one hand, the new colonizers from the highlands on the one hand, and then later with the state allowing for multinational companies or corporations to penetrate these lands to explore for oil exploration, or to use their indigenous lands for economic purposes. So this led to the politicization of their identity in order to defend their lands, because the loss of lands for them is kind of tantamount to the loss of their cultural identity. So they started to develop, to use their networks in order to develop new cultural norms and new way of understanding about the new circumstances and the changing of the political surroundings. And they started to articulate demands against the state predation or the new forms of environmentally destructive land grabbing. So from this kind of interaction between highlands communities and lowlands communities, and their interaction with the state and their reaction against state policies, so this offered new interpretation of ethnic relations and developed or constructed some sort of new ways of self-identification or self-image. So they started to debate like these kind of interactions and debates and deliberations in the late 70s and early 90s. So both like the Confederation of the Highlands and the Confederation of the Lowlands, they decided, to get together in order to form this national confederation. And it took, some time to negotiate positions as indigenous, like what kind of identity they have to project or to construct or to express, and what kind of political strategies they need to follow in order to advance their ethnic agenda, and what kind of goals they need to converge on. So here, so you have Kone in the mid 80s. So they have like these like three like pillars: tierra, cultura, and libertad, land, culture, and liberty. So as I mentioned, it's hard to imagine any kind of like unity or developing a homogeneous position between highland indigenous community and lowland indigenous community, because they had different perception and different actually image toward each other. Like for Andeans, they actually perceived Amazonians as they had like the same public imagery as savage and colonizers, and they lacked, some sort of cultural commonalities or like properties with Andeans. And for them, for Amazonians, for example, it's not the issue of land, it's not an issue of material and economic livelihood. It was an issue of autonomy, a cultural autonomy, and this relation with their own territories. So it's not a source for to to improve their living and economic conditions, but it actually a source for their dignity and cultural autonomy. So they develop, it's not only land but also territory, and it's not only um, like equality. It's not only territory. It's an autonomy, and it's not like equality or economic and social equality. It's a matter of cultural and economic and social autonomy. So they had like control over their natural resources. They had control over their own territories against state predation and penetration of foreign investors or multinational corporation. So they had to converge on common agenda and to decide on common political strategies in order to push for their own ethnic demands. And eventually they decided, to negotiate positions as Indians, and they agreed that it's a loss of land. It's kind of tantamount to loss of culture and indigenous identity. So that's why they had, this celebration of land, culture, and liberty in order to revolt or to rebel against their like subordinate position to the whites or to the mestizos. So instead, although the state actually offered them some political rights, so there's still some sort of segregation and discrimination against indigenous population. So effectively or realistically, they were unable to practice their political rights on equal footing with the whites or with the majority of the population. So that's why this actually heightened their indigenous identity and gave way to their ethnic identification to emerge in order not to be treated as a second-class citizens. And actually, again, like with the neoliberal policies as well, with this neoliberal turn that brought the issue of land security at the forefront and became like one of the top priorities of the indigenous people's demands. So one of the like turning point, or took the struggle to a different level with the organization of mass protest in 1990, that actually they had their what was called 16-point declaration. So it was like a nationwide demonstration that actually prevented or jeopardized all the economic and public activities, and forced the government and the state to negotiate with them and to actually to respond to some of their demands. So actually the declaration or these demands centered around the refusal to the imposition of any kind of taxes on rural lands. So they asked the state in order to guarantee or to offer some supply of water and the need of water and irrigation in order to resume or to continue with their agricultural activities. So they asked the state to offer subsidies and grants and funds in order to enable bilingual educations in order to preserve their own culture, and to actually to establish a plurinational country to be ratified in the constitutional rights, and the state actually responded to this in the late 90s. So actually, this kind of the interaction between different indigenous people and different organizations, the establishment of a national confederation, as I mentioned, this intersubjectivity and the interaction constructed new way of understanding and new cultural norms that heightened or accentuated, this kind of ethnic self-image between or among different ethnic or indigenous population, and actually forced the government to retrace, its steps regarding, privatization measures like the privatization of lands, and to allow for foreign investors to penetrate indigenous lands with the discovery of large oil reserves in the in the late 70s and allowing for different companies, to come in order to explore oil. So the actually forced the government to slow the pace of the reforms and to block the advance of these economic and reform measures on several occasions. And again, the push for this official, the state actually adopted or endorsed this in addition to this official multicultural discourse or rhetoric. So the state actually constitutionally guaranteed these rights and offered the suffrage rights to indigenous population that removed, this literacy condition that actually precluded indigenous population from casting a ballot in the elections before the 90s. So actually this interaction between organizational capacity, or with the factor of the organizational capacity and this political opportunity structure that offered them the opportunity to advance or to promote their ethnic and to mobilize along ethnic lines, these together helped the indigenous population or ethnic movement to become one of the most powerful political player at the national level. And not only they used or capitalized on the existing institutional opportunities to contest in elections at the local level, but actually they had they established or they built some national and political coalitions with other indigenous movements, and in the movement turned into a political party later, and most especially Pachacutec, this plurinational Pachacutec unity movement that actually for the new country. So they actually had this coalition with this party, and they coordinated, with other indigenous they coordinated with other social movements and other citizenship movement for the new country, and they actually managed, to contest in the local and provincial and national elections. And in all elections, they decided, to contest or to take part, and they managed to gain from 8 to 9 seats. And that was actually remarkable or striking in a country with this kind of weak party system and highly heterogeneous indigenous or highly heterogeneous demographic composition. So the ethnic mobilization or the ethnic movement was some sort of coalition with other political parties or other social movements, and that actually help them to access some the existing centers, power centers, in order to push for their ethnic agenda or to push for their own demands. So they managed to reshape in a way or another, or to have some contribution to the political dynamics or to the political processes, and they performed well at the local and the national levels, as I mentioned. So and even the participation of the indigenous movement or the indigenous participation in contentious events or in protest, they managed to overthrow a president before he finished his mandate, Bukaram, in 1997. And as I mentioned, they had a brief alliance with the junta in 2000 against Mahmoud. It actually discredited their democratic, essence or credential, because this kind of support of the military and their mobilization against some allies, as well as Gutierrez, that actually had some sort of representation in his indigenous representation in his cabinet, and actually mobilization against some of their candidates in Congress. So this actually undermined its ability, the indigenous movement or the National Confederation, to broaden, the support base beyond, or to reach beyond this ethnic support basis. So in some areas, they fared well electorally at the national and the local and the provincial levels. So they had like some deputies in order to represent the indigenous demands, or to aggregate, their demands into government policy programs, and to advance or to block, some sort of political policies by establishing and building coalitions with other political players. But on the other hand, they actually heightened or focused heavily on their ethnic identity. Didn't help them to reach beyond their core constituencies, or to appeal to non-indigenous population in order to widen or to broaden or to attract more supporters, or to appeal to more to wide segments of the society. But in total, these kind of organizational capacity, alongside permissible political environment or political structure, enable them to mobilize or to advance their or agenda that was like remarkable and striking in Ecuador, given this heterogeneity and given the weak of civil society associations throughout its history. And even like Amazonians, that the state actually, there was a total absence of the state presence there. The state actually didn't care about building infrastructure, so they managed to overcome this insurmountable logistical problems in order to have their, or to invest in the existing, church or local networks, in order to develop, to interact, and to develop new cultural norms, and to develop their own consciousness regarding their cultural autonomy, and regarding their affinity or attachment to lands and social and cultural and economic rights as well. So from another case is Bolivia. As I mentioned in the very last week, we talked about Morales and movement to socialism as an indigenous movement that reached power in 2005, and it was like another remarkable event in Latin America. Especially, it was not new to the political context in Bolivia, this kind of ethnic mobilization and the emergence of ethnic parties. But what was like remarkable there, it was like this kind of the appeal of Evo Morales and his movement to wide segments of society that actually put an end to or led to the collapse of the well-established party system, and put an end to the existence of the long-established, three parts there, and gave way to the movement to socialism to dominate the political scene in 2005. So Raul Madrid here, he tackled, the issue of ethnic mobilization from different perspective. Like, it's still from like this kind of ethnic discourse, analyzing the content of this discourse and how they recruited or they reached out, the parties, actually the indigenous parties, reached out to non-core constituencies in order to penetrate, power centers at the national level, especially in Bolivia. So the central point here is this kind of ethnic populism or ethnic populist parties that that attracted, non-indigenous population, attracted supporters from non-indigenous constituents. So they followed again this kind of mixed strategy, like with some sort of political and economic demands that appeal to wide masses, that offer their support, and they actually invested in the existing disillusionment with the traditional parties, and they developed new policy programs or new political platform. They offered new space of political representation with new aggregation or new articulation of new issues that attracted, some other supporters from outside the indigenous constituents. So what Morales actually, the political platform he campaigned on, or the entire political discourse of the movement, his movement, the discourse was based on these distinct economic policy programs in order to differentiate himself from the existing establishment or the existing elites. So he promised, or he actually called for nationalization and again, like state interventionist policies, like land reform measures, in order that was like one of the central demands of the indigenous communities, and responding to their cultural and educational demands, assured the expansion of bilingual educational system, or indigenous education in indigenous language. And again, he campaigned on anti-establishment policy programs or political platform, and instead of depending on intermediaries or these corporatist organizations in order to mediate to offer, like, organizational or institutional representation of population as it happened in import substitution industrialization era or corporatist period. He actually focused on the appeal or the charismatic, personality of Morales in order to attract, supporters, or to attract, to expand the base of support. So what was, like, as we mentioned before, like a neoliberal populist, it sounds odd in the beginning because it looks like, or it sounds as an oxymoron. So here as well, like ethnic populist parties, we may have like the same like questions or the same criticism. So how ethnic parties became kind of populist parties that attracted, supporters from outside the ethnic communities, their ethnic communities. So actually, for populist leaders, they had to appeal to undifferentiated, Marit actually quoted, violent, undifferentiated people in order to expand the support base. So that's why, like, ethnicity with this limited or exclusive focus on particular communities or particular segment of the population, so it doesn't go along with with populism. Like, you have to have this narrow focus on indigenous population or indigenous community to attract their votes or support, and to establish, this demarcating boundary or line between you as an indigenous and us and them, us as indigenous and them as non-indigenous. So with the populist appeal, you have to have like this, to focus on this category of people in order to have like wide mass support. And ethnicity, by definition, it entails some sort of exclusionary tendencies. So if you have a particular movement, or like transform it into a political party, so this party would enter, any kind of electoral contestation based on unidimensional competition, which is based on ethnic lines or ethnic agenda, because by definition, like competing over multi-dimensional programs, this would actually weaken the salience of the ethnicity. Like if you need to bilingual language, for example, like bilingual education, in order to safeguard the cultural autonomy of indigenous population. So focusing on this kind of narrow ethnic demand, it doesn't have something to do with the entire population or wide segments of society. Land reform measures, perhaps it's related more to rural communities or peasant communities in rural areas, but urban workers, don't care more about this land reform measures. So if you have like this bilingual education system, land reform, together with like nationalization, like state interventionist policies, pension reform, consumer subsidies. So you have like multidimensionality in your electoral programs. So you diluted in a way or another this ethnicity or lessening, or in a way or another this ethnic salience, or perhaps like weakened the centrality of ethnicity in your policy programs or electoral platform. And on the other hand, mobilizing or like campaigning on ethnic program, it entails some sort of, as I mentioned, constructing lines between us and them, other in like other ethnicity. So in order to attract or to heighten this self-identification amongst particular electoral constituencies, so this has to happen against other population or other identity. So this entails kind of electoral outbidding by playing into some sort of people's concerns and fears, and their sense of belonging or self-identification against not only their own self-image or self-identification, but in relation to other identities, like um, like indigenous people or Indians against mestizos, for example. So you have this, it's relational by definition, and it entails like electoral outbidding, or in order to attract or to solidify your support base amongst indigenous population. But what's remarkable in some cases, and particularly in particular Bolivia and Evo Morales' movement to socialism, that it actually didn't have this narrow focus on, or it didn't have this, it didn't limit, its discourse to indigenous population, but it reached beyond their own, even like their the province they initially emerged from. So they reached beyond they reached to other areas to attract some indigenous supporters in different areas, and it reached to other indigenous communities in order to attract that to found some sort of commonalities and common issues among them in order to support the MSA electorally. So Pachacutec, plurinational unity movement managed in a way or another by building some political coalitions, as I mentioned, in Ecuador on some occasions, but later it actually heightened its ethnic uniqueness or ethnic identity that narrowed its support base. But the movement to socialism, it managed to capitalize on non-polarized environment or non-exclusionary rhetoric. So it had like more inclusive political discourse that helped establishing or constructing, help with the construction or constructing a new sort of self-identification between wide segments of society or Bolivian people. So in this context of absence of ethnic polarization, this is the nature of ethnicity or ethnic relations in this context. With the absence of there was kind of fragmentation, but without like there's no some sort of deep-seated polarization or violence based on like before, during that period, based on like ethnic identification or some sort of self-image or self-identification. It changed later, but it helped, in the beginning, the movement to socialism in order to attract, to appeal to wide masses. and to actually to perpetuate, its power even after, the ousting of Morales last year. So the people like voted back, the MAS to office, in last month. So in this context of absence of polarization, of non-exclusionary rhetoric, it was like unpalatable to follow, this exclusionary electoral strategy. So it became like strategically, as a political leader, to adopt some sort of political and economic program that would appeal, that will be based on inclusivity in a way or another, and to attract, or to widen, or to expand your support base on the other hand. So what was going on, as I mentioned in the very last week, when we talked about, Bolivia and the emergence or the collapse of the party system there. So people started to get disenchanted or disillusioned with the traditional parties because of their the implementation of the privatization program, or the implementation of the neoliberal reform programs, and especially like the process actually culminated into the water war in Cochabamba, and then the gas war that led to the ousting of the president, and raised, the oppositional credential of Evo Morales. And actually with the coca eradication program as well, this kind of mobilization, or the movement to socialism actually mapped onto the pre-existing mobilization of coca growers in order to gain, their support as well. So the implementation of the neoliberal policies and the representation question and the availability of different ethnic-based parties out there that offered some avenues or space for representation for disgruntled or disaffected masses. Amongst, these political forces, MAS managed or emerged as one inclusive, with its some sort of inclusive and populist discourse that acquired or attracted, more supporters than other indigenous or ethnic-based parties. So Evo Morales, strategically, politically, and economically, he actually drew on the disillusionment with the traditional three parties, and he developed, or he promised, this new economic and social agenda with the promise of the more interventionist role of the state, and more fair distribution or just social order, in order to give like fair to have like a fair share of the national wealth, and to preserve, the natural resources against especially the gas, for example, against, the exploitation of the multinational corporation. So these demands actually appeal to wide masses, and actually enables him to gain more supporters, and to broaden, their the constituents beyond indigenous population. He actually gained support from mestizos and from leftists as like a class category as well, that they supported, they actually felt some sort of belonging to his economic and political discourse, that enabled eventually the movement to reach power in 2005. So I'll stop there today, and next time I'll continue on, and we will focus more on like the discourse, that the ethnic populist discourse of the movement, and how actually Evo Morales movement, with his movement, actually differentiated himself with this anti-establishment, anti-elitist discourse from other parties, and reached beyond his core electoral constituencies. Okay, see you next time. Bye.